Hello, and welcome to The Prepared Leader, From Crisis to Confidence. This is the podcast for leaders who know that tough times aren't a matter of if, but when. I'm Helen Lipscomb, and each month we bring you bold strategies, real-world stories, and practical insights to help you lead stronger, smarter, and with unstoppable confidence. Today, I'm joined by Robert Jumpp, an experienced cybersecurity leader with a strong track record in protecting organizations against evolving threats. Together, we are going to explore the intersection of cybersecurity and resilience. This is going to look at why cyber must be more than just an IT issue and how leaders can prepare for the risks of a connected world. So let's get into that. So today, my guest is Robert Jumpp, a senior leader with expertise in cybersecurity, information security management, and resilience. With extensive experience in global organizations, Rob brings both strategic and hands-on insights into how cyber risks are evolving and what leaders must do about them. Rob, welcome to today's show. It's really good to have you here. What would be really great if we can just kick off with your background, your experience, and really, I guess, add some more to the what I've shared in terms of your introduction, your expertise in cybersecurity, your journey to date.
Thank you, Helen. Thank you for having me for this conversation. Yes, my background, I was quite impressed with the introduction. Thank you. Yeah, I've been in the IT arena for more years than I care to mention, but within cybersecurity for about 20 years. My background is I was born in Jamaica, came to the UK when I was 4, brought up in Derby, went to university in Derby, and set up an IT company for systems integrators for schools, where for 12 years I ran a business up in Derby that transitioned from building computer systems, integrating networking computer systems, to securing computer systems. I then transitioned from that after 12 years into banking, where I became a senior security consultant for a well-known bank called Lance Leicester, which is now Santander. We take over by Santander.
Okay.
I then transitioned from that after a couple of years into defence and moving down to Reading, which is where I'm now based in Reading. That's where I first got involved in more the governance, risk and compliance side of cybersecurity. Got involved and became something known as a class consultant, a CSG listed advisor. CSG is a part of GCHQ, which is one of the agencies of the UK government. And by becoming a class consultant, it allowed me to go and advise government departments. And the government departments I've worked for in the last 10 years have been the Ministry of Justice, the Ministry of Defence, and the Foreign Commonwealth Office, where I've gone in and advised more from a technical perspective initially, because of my background, my 12 years of running more of a technical organisation for small businesses and medium-sized businesses, to more understanding government guidance. And what I've been impressed by over the last 10 years is how CSG, which is now the National Cybersecurity Centre, has evolved from being very dogmatic in terms of advising on security to being more inclusive and including all elements of society. So that's something I'd like to go on to talk about. But back to myself, the last large organisation I worked for was BAE Systems, which was a defence company. And for the last 7 years, I've been consulting through my consulting company of Positive Consultancy Solutions.
Fantastic. And I really like where you started to go in terms of that, how the industry's changed, because I think for a lot of people, we're more aware of it than maybe we were. And, you talked about some of those, your early career probably was very much not behind the lines, but I imagine you weren't able necessarily to talk about some of the things that we were dealing with. And there is much more of a publicly facing discussion around cybersecurity now. How have you found that change, and how have you sort of, you started to get into, this is much more openly discussed, and NCSC is starting to do more around talking about this topic. How have you found that change, and what do you think are the benefits of that?
Yes, I found it very, very refreshing. It's gone from a very 80s, 90s, 2000s dogmatic, do what we say, without a lot of evidence as to why, to now this is clear, good guidance, and it's become more refreshingly aligned to pulling organizations up rather than pushing organizations into a compliance, into silos. So it's become far more broader in terms of sharing that knowledge, far more in walking alongside us rather than following what we're saying to do. And I can give an example of those in some of my more recent contracts.
Okay, yeah, no, that would be really helpful. And I really like that, because I think, again, what I've seen from my side of the resilience space is this is a risk that more people are concerned about. It is a risk that more people are asking questions about. And it's not a risk that maybe leaders understand properly. So I think almost that hand-holding analogy that you sort of almost talking about with what the National Cybersecurity Centre is doing is really important, because there is a huge amount of education that needs to go alongside this. This is not something that leaders do maybe understand well enough. Yes, there's lots of examples of it happening to organizations, but I'm not entirely sure that leaders really understand what does that mean for us, and how do we prepare our own organizations for that. Is that, again, what you've sort of found in terms of your experiences?
Yes, it's more contextualized to allow leaders to understand, okay, this is from a small business perspective, this is it from a charities perspective, this is from a large organization's perspective, rather than one size fits all, because it can be quite difficult, especially when you're in a trust framework or a linked supplier. You're the supplier of a large organization. It's difficult to see, well, how does it apply to me? So when we look at the NIS directive, which is a European-wide, similar to GDPR sort of compliance framework, more for networks and infrastructure, for critical national infrastructure. But there are also elements of operators of essential services that initially an organization may not think they're an operator of an essential service because, well, I'm not a water company or I'm not a road system. But when you look at organizations like Marks and Spencer's, that it's an operator of essential services, and therefore their suppliers then are linked to an operator of essential services. So it's then trying to contextualize, okay, this is why we need to look at maybe a framework like ISO 27001 to prove or give confidence to a supply chain, or further up my supply chain or further down my supply chain. What I've noticed over the years is organizations higher in the supply chain have been very sort of contractual in terms of we'll either insure against this or we'll contract against this to say, okay, well, we'll contract against it to make the responsibility our supplier without being able to provide evidence that they are actually mature enough to do that. And so what I've found organizations, large organizations, refreshingly, are now sort of reaching down and potentially maybe not giving technological solutions, but maybe more giving examples of recommendations, or they're almost giving consulting for the small organization to try and bring them up.
That's interesting, because I had already started to go there earlier when you were talking about this kind of the support that's available to organizations. It is that recognition of, slight tangent to where we are to some extent, but it is that recognition of we do need to help organizations to recognize this risk. And like you say, those bigger organizations that probably have more established teams and more established processes, where they see a risk in their supply or where they see a risk with organizations that they're working with, I think that's a really interesting, I guess, concept and a really important thing that they should be thinking about. How do I help those small organizations be prepared? It is that wider concept of sort of whole society resilience. And I'm not going to get into that today, but it is, you're only as strong as your weakest link. And, that's the concept, isn't it? You're talking about there. And I think it's really important that organizations are starting to recognize that they can help each other out. And that they should be helping each other out to ultimately protect what's their core deliverables and their core business services. If those organizations fail, it impacts them.
Yes, and that's why it's so important to talk about. You mentioned risk. It's so important for organizations and leaders to understand what the risk is that they're managing. What I've noticed is when I've come into organizations to support the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer, or support directly into boards. I've been a trustee for a mental health charity where I've basically been effectively a non-exec. And I've seen those interplays of of the leaders not necessarily understanding what the risks are that they're accountable for. It's almost a human nature of avoidance or deflection, or also moving the responsibility further down in the organization. So that's where organizations can then become siloed in terms of, okay, it then goes into the technology silo and then risk goes under there, or it goes into the finance silo and then risk goes under there, but it never really makes its way up to the board. And this is something an adage I've sort of kept, that, in the event of a situation, we don't rise to the occasion. We fall to the level of our training. And our training is our experience, our knowledge, our understanding of our responsibility.
Yes.
And so, therefore, when we talk about risk, I learned this more from a technical perspective. It's when I was communicating security technology controls. As long as I understood what the business was trying to achieve, I could link those controls to those key drivers. It was more understandable for the leadership, the management teams, the middle management, senior management, executive management, to actually understand the value and their sort of responsibility. In that case, it was a control to address a risk. But what I found is risks have really been sort of siloed off for technology, and don't really meet board risks. And my sort of invitation is that the board expand on the risks they're carrying. They're normally sort of strategic risks, their financial risks, their operational risks, their resilience risks, as we're talking in this instance. And rather than sort of add on an extra risk that relates to technology, we incorporate the reputational risk. We can see that a ransomware attack could be seen as a reputational risk. It could also be a financial risk, and we try and interweave those, and then it comes down to that sort of shared responsibility. So it's not just about due diligence, due care, in terms of a board expressing, due care by making sure they have due diligence staff. It's also about the board, and this is another area I'd like to get onto, the board basically creating a culture. And I know when I say culture, it does sound very buzzwordish, but it's creating a culture where staff can feel, and another buzzword, psychologically safe enough to actually help empower what they're doing. So what I'm going to go on to is there's a lot of information. So when I stop talking, there's a lot more information available on the NCSE website that sort of covers this for small businesses, medium-sized businesses, large businesses, and especially for boards. They have a board toolkit that allows boards to become aware of like different principles of a culture or different codes of conduct that the board should be looking at, or at least aware of. And they have lots of training there as well. And without putting myself out of the job, my sort of and people like ourselves are there to help facilitate the learning. And again, coming back to we don't rise to the occasion, we fall to our level of training.
I really like that. And I think that's a really, really important point, because actually that's what we see again and again and again. It's almost that element of which other resilience individuals will be very familiar with, that, it's really difficult to be strategic. People tend to come down an organization because it's where they feel comfortable. It's where they've maybe spent most of their time being training. So senior leaders find it quite hard sometimes to stay at the most strategic level. They kind of want to do and play in the, how do we fix the organization? And we see this again and again and again. And it's a lot of what we focus on when we do leadership scenario testing, is making people feel comfortable in an area where they aren't, but maybe they haven't got that level of training and support, to your point, because it's not, as you're promoted through an organization, you become a leader for lots of different reasons, but a lot of that isn't necessarily down to the training and support that sits around you. Hopefully that's all there, but we see lots of examples, and we've seen lots of examples where that isn't the case. So senior leaders find it really easy sometimes to move down a level to where they feel comfortable when they're dealing with that. So I think that's a really good point. And how, I guess, to your point, what sounds very valuable is the material that is out there that can start those boards thinking about this in the right terms, and that then we can, as consultants, go in and support them to actually then challenge their conceptions, challenge how they're they're applying this, and that then becomes the training and the capability building, because that's the other thing that was sort of ringing through my head as you were talking. Is there's two elements. One, culture piece is about capability. It's about how do people feel comfortable in challenging things, how do people feel comfortable in doing things differently. The other thing which is sort of associated with that in terms of, how do you recognize that is, and it'd be interesting to see your view on this, is from a risk perspective. You talked about those silos that you see in organizations. Cyber maybe is a technology risk. I see more and more organizations that have got this at that strategic corporate risk register level. But to your point, I don't think they necessarily are thinking about it in the holistic way. They are thinking more about how do we stop a cyber threat. I think if you would maybe to talk to some of those leaders, they do think about the reputational impact, but that's not written down. That's almost implicit. So there's a question mark of actually, do you really understand this risk? Or are you just thinking about the technical aspects of, we don't want to be faced with it, so what do we do to minimize it, rather than how do we face headlong into it when it happens, and what's our plans in that moment? Which I think is an interesting way of looking at how do people then holistically manage risk.
Great question. It's the what and the how, and without it sounding very spiritual. And spiritual and cyber doesn't seem to come together, but
not always good bedfellows.
Not always, but yeah. But ultimately, it's the Temple of Delphi. The sign above. The words above. Know thyself. It's first to understand, and this can be at any level of leadership. We have biases. We have fundamental biases that our reptilian brain will go back to. We may try and overthink things, but ultimately our reptilian brain will win. And that, through, whether it be fight, freeze, friend, in terms of those sort of biases. And it's understanding ourselves to know, okay, well, this is normally what I go to. I go to a freeze, or I go to a fight, and when you look at both, maybe a middle management, senior management, executive management, it's understanding, okay, where should our bias go to? And you mentioned about strategy, because sometimes companies don't always communicate their strategy. The strategy may be at the board level. They may think they're communicating their strategy through the mission statements and sort of vision. But ultimately, the person in front of the client, or selling the service, or operationally delivering the package, may not fully understand what the strategic, or where the strategy is moving from and to. They may be, their bias may be to still stay with where the current strategy is, but not understanding where they're moving to. And so therefore, from a board level, it's understanding, okay, this is where our company is. These are the strengths, weaknesses, opportunities here. So, and when we look at the risks, for having a risk, there is also an equal and opposite opportunity available. And it's trying to steady the ship from a board level, is to understand, okay, where is the balance of equilibrium here? Where are we? Are we far more on a legacy, or are we too far towards an area that we're not aware of? And so what do we need in terms of training, in terms of understanding, to understand, okay, we understand our GDPR, so we understand where all our data is, and we understand which organizations have our data. But are we aware of all the organizations that have access to our systems? There's an awareness, or an awareness from the board that we understand GDPR. We have an information asset register. We have people that are looking after that, but they may not also be aware of, okay, and there are these people that don't necessarily hold our information, but they have access to our information on our systems. And as you say, the tendencies from the board to try and go back to a previous job role.
Yeah.
And then try and, go into analysis. So if they're from a legal background, they'll go to a contractual job role. If they're from a technical background, they'll go to a control job role. But it's equally also, from a training perspective, understanding, okay, in this role that I've now moved up to, so if I've gone from working on the factory floor to being a supervisor, I now know what a supervisor role is. Because sometimes you find many supervisors that are still they're too hands-on, effectively.
They're still doing the do, aren't they? They can't transition to a leadership role, which is what you're asking them to do at that point.
And that transition is also from an informational role, so they have information to understand it, but they also have, I use the adage that we are the average of the 5 people we know, whether that be in our social life or whether that be in our work life. So therefore, if the 5 people I know are on the production line, I'm the average of those 5 people, even though I'm a supervisor. It's encouraging organizations to have these peer groups at those levels. So at an executive level, it's making sure you're surrounding yourself with people that have financial backgrounds, that have legal backgrounds, and then using the training gives you an understanding of the people at your level, in terms of 360 above, below, and around.
Yeah.
And so when you've moved up to that level of leadership, it's ensuring that you're understanding now, this is what my role is, rather than sort of falling back. Circling back to the understanding, it's something you said gave me an impression of whack-a-mole in terms of the next issue that comes up, we're going to whack, rather than understanding there are so many moles that we can whack, and let's whack the biggest mole that's actually in the direction, context of what we're doing.
Yeah.
And so for that, I'm going to lean back to NCSC training that's available, and people like ourselves that can then help with our knowledge and experience of those situations, be from the 5 people help average up the board level, from running a small business, working with small businesses, working with directors, to working in banking, working in defense, working in above secret systems, and realizing the commonality of all those. They're so much similar in terms of what they offer, but equally it's also recognizing the distinguishing differences. So from working from a charity to working within BP, say, different outcomes, different sort of directions, different motivations. And also you have different people around you that sort of bias you with their biases and your own biases.
True.
And I'm going to stop talking now to allow us to get back in that conversation. And it comes down to that sort of spiritual becoming, understanding ourselves, to understand our own strengths, weakness, and opportunities that could then influence. So when I would go to a board and I'd give a risk-balanced case as to why to do a thing or not to do a thing. It's equally understanding the biases inherent in that board member.
Yes.
So
Yeah. Which I think comes back to me, that culture leadership thing. When we are, and in a lot of cases, the work that we do, you and I do, we are trying to influence people and change behaviors, change attitudes to build a more, I suppose, where my head was, more appropriate culture that supports what we want to achieve. And you can't do that without spending that time of understanding, what are they bringing into the room? What are those biases? What are their understanding of this risk? What is their experience of this risk? Because again, you'll have, individuals that maybe have managed through a cyber event, and then you'll have people that never seen anything.
Traumatized.
Potentially been traumatized. Absolutely. Very, very likely been traumatized. That is going to become a greater thing in terms of, organizations are facing this risk more frequently at different levels of their organization. So I think, that it takes me back to many, many years ago, just the concept of how to understand communicating risk and risk perception. You have to understand the biases, the experiences that people bring into the room to even start to challenge and influence and reshape that. It's not necessarily breaking that down, because it is about building on that and sort of taking that as the learning to move forward and to build the organization better from there. I guess that, and just listening back to your sort of views on the National Cyber Centre and the good work that they're doing, if you're thinking around, that re-influencing culture, thinking about the guidance that's out there, thinking about the tools that are available to organizations, is there one thing that you think organizations should be focusing on right now to improve their cyber resilience, preparedness for that kind of threat?
Good question. But I'd like to circle back to what we spoke about in terms of previous experience, previous history, previous trauma that companies may sort of suppress and repress and try and go beyond by normally not necessarily with a band-aid, but with a psychological sort of gap. Okay, we'll do a penetration test on here once every year, and that'll make sure that goes away. Or we'll send out phishing emails to our staff, and that'll make sure it goes away, without helping to develop the culture. And this is the answer to your question. It's helping from a board level, creating a culture where there is, and I'm going to use the word psychological safety, because it's amazingly, I've seen it used by the National Cybersecurity Centre which, having that understanding of, or compassion. And I don't say that from a compassion from a woolly sense. I'm saying compassion from I understand our staff could feel inclined not to report an instance, or push back on a senior manager who's saying that they should be exporting, not following our policies.
Yes.
Not feeling that they're safe enough to be able to challenge.
Yes.
And that's where the board is able to create that culture. And to have, even going back a year or two, to think, okay, airy-fairy, what does that mean by culture? But then to have an actual prescribed these cultural principles. They have these, NCSC have 6 principles. And when I read through those principles, it sort of shows good behavior, bad behavior, and it helps educate or give knowledge to upper management, senior management, executive management, to understand, okay, I see why this might be a problem. And I can see how, rather than dictating, I can include. And so therefore create a culture from a high level, but also help, and without it sounding airy-fairy again, help individuals understand that cyber is part of their role as well.
Yes.
And I don't just mean that as people are the weakest link. I mean, people are also able to identify they have an intuitive nature as well. So once they understand once they've been educated, that intuition can also be released as well. So for example, I look at ChatGPT sometimes, I ask it a question, then I realize it's actually telling me a lie here. It's sort of reinforcing, or almost, what do you call it, gaslighting me into thinking that it knows best.
Exactly.
And equally, that could be applied to the policies, processes, and standards within an organization. Maybe the organization doesn't know best. And if a culture can be created where the marketing department can approach more quickly and include cyber within whatever initiative that's trying to meet strategy for business, but equally trying to take on the responsibility of being safe, secure, and trustable by other organizations. That's where, I think that's the answer. That's my answer for now, in terms of become aware of your organization, become aware of principles at a board level, at a leadership level, that can help, and use others' experiences, like yours and mine.
Absolutely. Yes. Yeah. And I really like that element of, the education of everybody in the organization is really that shared responsibility, because everybody does have a responsibility in this. It is not just the leaders. It is not just the cybersecurity functions. It is not just the sort of operational teams. Again, the element of culture that you are talking about is that whole recognition that we all have an understanding of this risk. We want to make sure it's a shared understanding of this risk. And from that, what actions could we as a collective be taking to protect our organizations, to respond when these events happen in a positive way? That means that organizations come out of these events, which again are more frequent and more impactful, and survive. And I guess to some extent are all Marks and Spencers of this kind of event, as opposed to other organizations that don't exist, where they've maybe been through cyber attacks. And I do think that's a really important point that leaders need to recognize. I also really like that element you talked about with what NCSC do in terms of what's positive, what's negative, what are those examples? Because I think, again, it makes it tangible. Culture is quite an amorphous thing that we often talk about, and we talk about the concept of influencing, we talk about the concept of change, and we talk about, again, when I talk about this to people in terms of business continuity and resilience, I'm often, psychological safety comes up, because it's kind of where safety is now is where we want to get this, where we want to get resilience and business continuity in cyber. You want it to be seen as an important topic and part and parcel of how organizations run. We're not there yet, but tools that can help communicate that in a way that is understandable and shows you the behaviors and the attributes that you should be working towards are really important, because I do think that's where leaders maybe aren't quite clear on what am I being asked to do, what does good look like. So I think anything that anyone can do to help give those examples is really important.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's also making sure that you can communicate to those people in a way that they will understand. So it's all very well leadership talking down and asking, okay, what is our maturity level? It's equally responsible for middle management to be able to communicate back up. But there needs to be that common language. And I think risk can be a helpful common language, especially when there's that disclosure at a high level of the enterprise risk, and then linking that down to the individual financial, cyber, operational risks. Having a common way of talking. Each of those will have their own nuances, of course, but there'll also be an overlap as well. And so, from even just a human perspective, it allows the board to see patterns and to be able to then not necessarily intuit, but to be able to intuit effectively. Use their experience, and to do that, it's using tools like scorecards, like traffic light systems that then back off. And I'm not going to go down to the level of automation or AI automation to reflect it, but then back off to testing the operational processes using tools like tabletop exercises or more regular sort of tests of operational processes or security processes. There's a website called Register that sort of bites the hand that feeds. It's a news source that shows the latest cyber incidents, and the latest one has been Capita being fined 16 million for disclosing 6.6 million client, and it's not that Capita weren't prepared. It's not that Capita didn't have good operational systems. It's just that the SLAs weren't actually being picked up by senior management, higher management. So an SLA that said that they should have been able to discover this within 2 hours, it took 58 hours. And in that 58 hours, a lot happened. And it's learning to, okay, we have from a board level, we have a policy, we have process, we have standards, and but in this instance, we didn't follow the process. We didn't. An event was categorized as category number 2. It should be category number 1. But even that it was category number 2, it wasn't actually acted on within 2 hours, and we didn't have sufficient number of staff. We only had 1 analyst on staff, and it's then understanding. Okay, we may have these processes, we may test them once a year. And we may have, like a finding was from a penetration test, was that they shouldn't have a domain admin for this particular account. And that had been on the penetration test for like 3 or 4 years, but never got to a level of, and it's understanding that people can have psychological safety to be able to escalate that up.
Yeah.
And that risk, which is a reputational risk, can become more and more enhanced on the board.
I think that, again, that's really interesting, because that element of, the learning of lessons, and to your point of that ongoing challenge and discussion of, we are seeing, these trends we are seeing the same challenge each time, the same lesson, the same gap is being identified. We are not, we've done penetration tests, it's identified this every time, and we're not doing anything about it. And individuals not feeling safe or not feeling able to do anything about that, other than I record that in a log and then we'll do another penetration test next year, and we know full well that might be the same. We'll identify the same gap and we'll put it on a risk register. To your point, I really, that risk is a really important base language in a lot of this, and I really do believe that. Where I think organisations struggle is making that as a live conversation. And part of that is that encouragement to talk about risk. Part of that is that encouragement to challenge, to raise issues as much as risks, to have those open discussions around what are we doing around this? Are we actively managing risk? Because putting it on a risk register, which lots of organizations do very well, isn't managing risk. That is documenting risk. And this has been a recurring thing in the back of my head. There's that element, everyone then suddenly feels really comfortable. It's a bit of what you just said, we've got a plan, we've got a process. It says that we can do things within 2 hours. So I feel great. I'm really happy. We've not challenged that. We've not really evaluated, can we do this within that time frame? And what resources do we need to do it within that time frame? To some point, is that a reasonable time frame based on the risk? Or is that just an arbitrary number that someone picked that said, oh, I think we should be able to do this within 2 hours, so let's put that down. Because that often can be the case, is that, and I've seen this recently, more worrying to some extent, is people in business continuity plans start to talk about, well, this is something we need to do immediately. And I'm sort of looking at that and kind of going, I don't know what that means. But you think that means something. You think, like that shared language piece, I've written immediately, so that means it's really important. Well, immediately isn't a time frame. So immediately doesn't tell me that it's important. Immediately might, for me, mean I'll get to it in 3 days, potentially, without being clear. Again, some of that is without having the rationale behind it to say, well, why are we saying this? And actually, what do we mean by that? Let's define that if we want to use that as a term. Because again, we end up with so many assumptions of what we think we can do by when. The scenario testing that we do, and whatever complexity you do that to, and we do different complexities at different times, should help to tease that out. But I do think, again, there's an element of, for us doing this, almost challenging ourselves to say, well, actually, do we think we've really tested it? Do we think we've really evaluated that? And if it hasn't worked, what are we doing about it? And how are we encouraging that learning of lessons to an actual, we've followed through on those learnings, rather than just, again, we've put it in a report somewhere and we all feel really happy that we ran a really good exercise.
I'm smiling because I'm thinking of, as you're talking, thinking of the analogy of like a car dashboard and a flashing light about the oil, and the pen test or the risk register being a bit of masking tape that you put over that. And yes, it has gone away. Yes, you have addressed it. You may not have addressed the root cause of it, but you've addressed the flashing light. And it's equally trying to make sure that those lights are communicated. And that's why I go to ISO 27005, so there's a common language. So immediately means this level of severity and this level of impact. And it's commonly understood at a senior management level. And that can become commonly, so we're not getting different levels of, who I trust from a board perspective. Is it a person that's calm and confident, or is it a person that's showing me a technical thing? What do I do?
Yeah.
And then it's trying to empower people by saying, okay, relax. It's a safe space. I'm almost going Buddhist here. It's a safe space. We can open up about our own experiences. We can release that trauma of something that went wrong, and that's why I'm doing this. Is my bias, and we can come up with a common language. And it's not just within an organization or siloed within a division, within an department, within an office. It's allowing it to break that silo within the organization, also to break the silo between organizations, between the higher and the lower organization, to allow them to have that conversation about patching. I know in our contract we've said that you should be able to patch this P1 within this time frame, but we appreciate that this might not be. But as long as you tell us about it, we can then map that with our other suppliers and maybe come up with a common way of handling this. And so it's like a shared responsibility. And I don't mean that when I hear shared responsibility, it takes me back to the shared responsibility model of cloud infrastructure, where, it's a shared responsibility. We know what we're responsible for in the cloud, and Microsoft or Amazon knows what they're responsible for in the cloud. But again, it's like a little band-aid of, okay, Microsoft's going to sort out our servers in the cloud, not understanding we do need to change the oil, or we do need to do the patch.
Yes. Yeah, I think you're right, because shared responsibility does, again, without being clear on what do you mean by that and how we're defining that, it gives a sense of confidence. I know, we're sharing this responsibility, but I'm assuming that you're doing the lion's share of that, and I'm just doing this little bit over here, and vice versa. You're assuming the same, but in your direction, without being clear on, well, this is the bit that is shared, and to make the shared element work, individual organizations have to do these parts. You have to build your resilience here. You have to, do this level of testing, and you have to put this level of controls in place so that the bit we all have responsibility for works and continues to work and is resilient to these kind of events and these kind of threats.
Yeah, it's having that common understanding of what oil is. And there is a level of oil, but not without too much detail. So you don't need to know where oil is produced or the ultimate why of why it's in the engine, but you just need to know is important.
Yeah.
So you need to know that the information we have on our clients is important. I don't need to know the detail behind that. But I do need to know that it needs to be protected to a certain level. I need to know, and I can help support that mission of protection.
Yes.
So it's seeing that with different contexts, and with the NCSC guidance, it helps break down. Provides guidance. In the past, it was do what we say without understanding, but now it's do what we say, and this is where we've seen it happen in real world. And in your mind, you can then reverse back. Oh, okay, this is how I can see it happen here. And from a board perspective, giving that culture or that psychological safety, I think that's the fourth time I've said it, it's allowing organizations to do the tabletop exercises, not just at a theoretical level, but at a practical level.
Yes.
And test the processes, or even in the first place, actually write down what the processes are.
Wouldn't that be good? That would make our lives so much easier than having to come in and write the process before we then look at the plan B, the plan C, the plan D, what could go wrong. It would be quite nice if that was written down.
Absolutely, just at a high level, just from an end to end. Because there may be level 1, level 2, level 3, level 4 process levels we don't need to know of, how to open the oil tank, how to pour in the oil. We don't need to know that. We just need to know we need to hand off to this team that does it, and I need to report back that it's done.
Yeah, and by doing all of these steps, the engine keeps running. That's the thing, and that knowing the end point is important, and knowing the teams or the steps at a very high level that have to work together to make the end point is, to your point, that's all we need. We don't often need the detail. Yes.
And it's not just the engine gets running, but from a risk perspective, the operational risk of delivering on a customer's assignment has been performed by having the technical risk of engines seizing addressed. And it all joins up.
It does. The dream all works together.
Well, it's a dream, but it's like the dream of having a fit body, or the dream of passing an exam. It starts with an intention.
It does. Exactly that. And I think, again, I'm sure leaders listening to this are kind of asking that question of, what is that right intention? What is it I'm trying to achieve? And again, it comes back to us, maybe leaders are listening to this thinking, what should I focus on? Or what's that one skill that maybe I need to be thinking more about that can help me prepare my organizations?
Okay, I would challenge that by saying, first of all, be kind to yourself. Don't beat yourself up by saying there is this one thing.
That's a good point.
Maybe more than one thing.
Yes.
So first of all, take a breath. Understand that this has been done by other organizations. Mm-hmm. It's something that it's not just measure once, cut once. It's measure a number of times before you cut to do that first thing. And it's finding that biggest domino. Mm. So my sort of suggestion for a big domino would be to look at the NCSC website. Mm-hmm. Look at the principles. Look behind why the principles are there. They give some examples. There's a cyber governance code of practice that can be rolled into the board, so they can understand their responsibilities. And then take it one step at a time. So first of all, understand where am I at? Where, before looking for weaknesses, look for strengths. Look for what good operational processes do I have an end to end? Do I understand, do I understand what I'm trying to communicate in terms of the strategy of the organization? Do I understand that first before I communicate? And have I enrolled the organization? That's probably 2 or 3, but the first one would be understanding the principles.
Yeah. And I think that's a really good key takeaway for individuals, again, to come to, particularly to your point of there are some very good resources out there that can start you on the right track in this. And that I think almost as a reflection of what you're saying is you're not alone in this, because that lots of organizations, all organizations are dealing with this threat and this reality. And I think we should all be working together to support each other and recognizing that we can all learn from each other. And it's important to share where you can your approach and your experiences, so that other organizations can learn. And I think, again, it's that model you talked about earlier of those bigger organizations supporting the smaller organizations and having that kind of that impact across the organization.
It's also trust as well, to be able to have those open conversations, both vertically and laterally.
Yes.
Potentially between competitors.
Yeah, that's a very good point as well. That is a very good point. Yes, and I think that's that kind of how open do you feel you can be in these scenarios. But I do think these kind of events and resilience as a whole, this isn't something that single organizations are impacted by. All organizations are impacted by these events. And to me, this is I guess there's lots of other places that people would say that, but I do feel like that there should be that level playing field of where you can try not to let that competition element and that other element play into this. The more we talk about this, the more we understand it, the more we build that shared knowledge. And that does help us to be prepared.
Absolutely. And so I go back to you are the average of the 5 people you know.
Yeah.
And so therefore, if you start surrounding yourself with people lower than yourself, you'll average down. If you surround yourself with people higher than yourself, you'll average up. Now, there is a challenge of being able to talk to competitors, to talk to, to peers. And that's where organizations can use people like you and I that have those experiences and can filter those through to allow them to average up.
Definitely. Yeah, I think you're right. That's definitely where you can learn from other organizations in a safe environment as well. Fantastic. Thank you so much, Robert. It's been a very fascinating conversation that I think we probably could continue for a long time. But as we wrap things up, where can people connect with you and learn a bit more about you and your work, the work that you do to support organizations?
Through LinkedIn. That's one. So Robert Jumpp on LinkedIn. I think there's only one Jump spelled Jumpp.
Yes.
And also through Positive Consultancy Solutions. That's robert.jumpp@positiveconsultancy.com. And then there'll be a website that associates that. And I'll be sharing the links to NCSC to yourself. And they're also going to be available on the website as well.
Fantastic. Thank you. Yes. And we can include that in the information that we share about this podcast so that people get access to all those, including your information as well. So we'll make sure that's out there. Fantastic. Thank you again, Rob, for joining me today on The Prepared Leader. If you as listeners have found this valuable, please follow, rate or share this episode with somebody who's leading through change right now. Until next time, stay ready and stay resilient.